It's a time when there are a lot of moving parts in the relationship, when the passions over the relationship, as is usually the case, are running very high, when there's a lot of partisan division, a lot of polarization. But one of the things that I learned in researching this history is that in general, Americans tend to feel more strongly about this topic than they are inclined to think about it. And that I was struck over and over again as I worked on this book, that there were so many things that everybody knew were true. Some of them are things that I had thought were true. But when you begin to drill down and look at stuff more seriously, you just see that that's not the case. Now, some would like to say, well, it's all a result of prejudice and bias, that there's so much emotion around this, and there certainly is on all sides. But there's also the relationship in itself is difficult. When I talk to Israelis about the United States, I often find that Israelis are, sort of see America as a kind of mirror of things in Israel, and they'll go, Netanyahu, Trump. But you come, and in fact, they're quite different politicians with quite different approaches. But you will also find lots of people in the United States who see in Israel a mirror of what's happening here or what they wish were happening here. But what I tried to do in this book was to focus on taking down some of the myths that surround this relationship. And as I started to do that, I thought this is going to be a very simple book. I'll write a couple of, nice 250-page book, be out of it onto something else. But it was the strangest experience of starting to realize as I looked at this, that there was a lot more going on than I had dreamed. And furthermore, that it was much more important to American history and American culture than I'd understood. Oddly, Israel is less important to American foreign policy than it is to American culture and politics. I write in the book that Israel occupies a speck on the map of the world, but it occupies a continent in the American mind. And if you want to understand both the controversies that swirl around our Israel policy and our national preoccupation with Israel, getting to explore that continent turns out to be something that's rather useful. So I also made a decision early on in writing this book that I would not do any policy advocacy. This would not be Walter Mead's 5-point plan for solving the Middle East problem. I was not going to be the one that would draw the boundary or chart the map. I was not going to judge between the parties and say, these people are right, these people are wrong, or even it's 60-40 and here's where the balance is. I would simply try to understand what was happening as best I could, put that in some kind of historical context in the US, and then let people, wherever they come at on these issues, let them think about it, reflect, and see if maybe we couldn't all be a little smarter. And I think it was also important that I was not going to try to sort of make this a moral issue. There's a tremendous drive, both among people who are supportive of Israel and people who are deeply anti-Zionist, to look at this as a moral question. And obviously, morality comes into human affairs and foreign policy, but not as simply as you might think. In the 20th century, the United States allied itself with Stalin, one of the worst mass murderers in the history of the world, in order to defeat Hitler. And it allied itself with Mao at the peak of the Cultural Revolution in order to balance against the Soviet Union, which had become strong in part because of the American alliance with Stalin and the price that we had to pay for that. So that even if everything that the most vociferous and principled and strong-minded advocates for the Palestinian cause says about Israel and its wrongdoings, even if all of that is true, it might nevertheless be necessary for the United States to align itself with Israel in its foreign policy for some particular reason. And on the other hand, even if everything that the most vociferous, strong Zionists in Likud or to the right of Likud said about the Palestinians and the terrorism and all these, even if all of that were true, it might still be necessary for the United States in its foreign policy to actually work with the Palestinians on some issues. And that's the way we treat this dispute. It's the way we treat so many others in the world. This is not unique. So we may not like Turkey's policies toward the Kurds or some of those policies, but Turkey's Kurdish policy isn't and cannot be the sole basis of American policy toward Turkey. We may not like what's happening to the Uyghurs in China, and that dislike and what it tells us about the nature of that government is all true. Nevertheless, when we think about the U.S. relationship with China, other issues are at stake that actually dwarf the fate of the Uyghurs. For example, not having nuclear war with China that kills hundreds of millions or billions of people. It's not immoral to put that objective ahead in a particular case of some other problem like the problem of the Uyghurs. And part of what I try to do with this book is put this issue in context, put this history in context. One of the things that I discovered writing, and I hadn't really thought about it before, but that a key element of the Israeli-Palestinian struggle is something that is not unique to either Israelis or Palestinians. All over the world, you see very, very deep and bitter issues, but when you have a native population that was under a colonial empire, and while that empire was in power, it allowed, promoted, or encouraged large-scale immigration of some kind into that territory. So, for example, after East African countries gained independence from Britain, one of the things they did was drive hundreds of thousands of Indians out of places like Uganda because they had come while the British were ruling, they were trading. They hadn't done anything wrong. In many cases, those families had been there for decades or generations. But because the people who lived there had never consented to the immigration, there was a deep sense that they were interlopers and that their presence was unacceptable. The Rohingya in Myanmar are people who came in many cases over a century ago when both Burma and India were under British rule. And it was British policy to encourage certain kinds of migration. And since independence, since Burma gained independence, there have been waves of expulsions of people or the descendants of people who arrived there under British rule. In the 1940s and 50s, as the Egyptian revolution consolidated, they didn't only drive out Jews from Egypt following the Israeli War of Independence. Many Greeks and others who had settled in Egypt under Ottoman and British rule and become the kind of merchant class of those countries were driven out. The Greeks, as I understand it, voted against the two-state partition plan at the UN in 1947 because they were hoping that this would help prevent the Greeks in Egypt from being driven out. They tried it, it didn't work. But in any case, the emotional context of the Israeli-Palestinian situation is not unique either to Israelis or Palestinians or to this situation. Obviously, it has unique features. And this also suggests that just as in some of these other cases I've mentioned, the moral dimension is difficult to measure accurately, right? It is also true that this situation, the Israeli-Palestinian situation, is a complex one. Now, beyond that, I don't really want to go. I'm happy to try to get into whatever subjects you would like in Q&A, but I'd like to spend the rest of my talk talking about a couple of the myths that I found were particularly difficult to, or particularly cloud people's minds, and that I really wanted to focus on attacking. And the first myth that, and this myth was, my sort of sense that this myth was a problem, was one of the reasons I really started writing the book in the first place, and that is this idea that somehow American policy toward Israel is the result of Jewish power in the United States. Now, that's actually not something I got from reading books by professors from universities not 1,000 miles from here about it. It's actually something I got for many years. The State Department would have me ask me to go give tours of public diplomacy around the world and give lectures on American foreign policy to audiences. I must have done it in 30 or 40 countries over the years. And what I would find over and over again is that even fairly sophisticated people would tell me that America supports Israel because the Jews run America. I mean, you know, people will, outside of the American context where you would normally not say such a thing, people just say it openly with no sense that it's either anti-Semitic or anti-American. They believe that this is just a simple fact. I'm actually of the view that anti-Semitism is not just a moral failing, which it is, like all forms of prejudice and hate, but it is also a crippling intellectual defect, in the sense when somebody says, the Jews run the banks, what they're telling you is they don't have the first idea how the financial system works. That this whole aspect of a modern economy and a modern society is just a closed book to them. And they're sort of operating on the basis of folklore, prejudice, whatever, but they don't know. If you say the Jews run the media, you're saying you really don't know what the media business is all about. And by the way, if you think, as many do in the US and abroad, that American public opinion has been pro-Israel as much as it has because the Jewish media are relentlessly pro-Israel, you haven't sort of noticed that the media source that is the most pro-Israel and has been for many years is owned by an Australian Christian, Rupert Murdoch. It's called Fox, and its personalities are people like Tucker Carlson, Huckabee, O'Reilly. The least Jewish television network in the United States is the most pro-Israel. But you know, these things don't make an impression on people. So as I looked at American history, what I saw was that the American Jewish community historically was not very Zionist. There was a Zionist movement. It was actually small for much of the time, and it was generally among Jews who were less well-educated and less well-off. American Jewish leadership, by and large, was anti-Zionist right up until World War II. And if you wanted to raise money for Jews in Palestine in the 1920s and 1930s in the United States, you had to state that this was to assist poor Jews. You had no connection with the political project of Zionism. When Congress was debating whether to support the Balfour Amendment to put it into U.S. law, the strongest opposition to it came from prominent American Jews led by Henry Morgenthau Sr., who had been Wilson's ambassador to the Ottoman Empire and was really the most prominent American Jew of the day, who took out a full-page ad in the New York Times with 400 signatures of other prominent Jewish leaders attacking the idea of a Jewish state and of the Balfour Declaration. The Jewish power in this country at that time, to the extent Jews were politically organized and trying to do something, was to try to stop the quota system and the immigration restriction, which was passed by the same Congress that put the Balfour Declaration in American law, cut Jewish immigration to the United States by over 90%, and is responsible for many Jews being trapped in Europe and unable to flee the increasing anti-Semitism of the 30s. Jews were not very powerful at the time. They were not very focused on Zionism. But at the same time, before Herzl wrote Der Judenstaat, before there was an organized modern Jewish Zionist movement, President Benjamin Harrison was sitting peacefully in his office in, I think, 1893, when he got a petition asking him to work toward the establishment of a Jewish national state in Palestine. This petition was signed by John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the editors of virtually every important newspaper in the United States, virtually all of them Protestant, by the way. The New York Times was a pro-Zionist newspaper under Christian ownership. When it was sold to a Jewish family, it became an anti-Zionist newspaper. So in America, the kind of historical sources of support for the idea of a Jewish state are not primarily Jewish. If you were going to try to construct some sort of theory that American support for Israel is related to the power of American Jews, you would have a tough time. Think about the 1930s, the all-powerful Jews. They try to get the United States to do something about Hitler, for the State Department to boycott German goods. They get nowhere. Well, if you won't do anything about Hitler in Germany, will you at least increase the quotas to allow Jews to flee? You get nowhere. During the World War II, the U.S. is at war. American Jewish leaders asked the Roosevelt administration, can you please just spare a few bombers to bomb the rail tracks leading to Auschwitz? And they can't get it. But those who believe that American policy toward Israel is driven by the Jews will then turn around and tell you that in 1947 and 1948, it was the all-powerful, all-conquering American Jewish community that forced Harry Truman to support the Jewish state. So somehow between 1944, when they can't get a squadron of bombers for Auschwitz, and 1947, they've somehow taken over the country. All right. Now, surely if that happened, there would be some talk about it somewhere. There would be a sort of, how did they do it? Who did it? Who were the leaders? Nothing. But then those same Jews in 1948, who were supposedly forced Harry Truman to recognize Israel, They must have all died of the plague by 1953 when Eisenhower comes in and makes support for Nasser and Saudi Arabia the keystone, the cornerstones of American policy in the Middle East. Israel is frozen out. Israeli prime ministers are not invited to the White House. They can't even buy arms from the United States, much less get arms aid. So, and yet, this period in the 1950s is when the American Jewish community was more pro-Israel than it had ever been, and perhaps would be again. Because at the time, Israel was a country of refugees from the Holocaust, from the Middle East, as Arab countries drove Jews out in retaliation, supposedly, for the War of Independence. All right. So a poor, hungry country filled with refugees, the American Jewish community rallies to it, and it cannot affect the Eisenhower administration's policy. Eisenhower pays no political price for this, is reelected in a landslide, and leaves office widely venerated. Right? So this notion that Jewish power is somehow shaping American policy toward Israel is incoherent nonsense. And yet, and again, I'm not primarily talking about, you know, sort of the American academic world, but out there in the country, and certainly even more so in Europe and Asia and Latin America, and of course the Middle East, this Jewish power theory is taken as gospel. To me, this illustrates the power of anti-Semitic memes and cultural concepts that get lodged into people's heads, who may not think of themselves as anti-Semites or as victims of prejudice, but just sort of uncritically follow certain pathways of thinking. Other forms of prejudice work the same way. In the 21st century, we can see the same thing. The most pro-Israel presidents in 20th century American politics have been George W. Bush and Donald Trump, right? Both of them were immensely unpopular among American Jews. And it's not just in the voting where large Jewish majorities voted against both of these presidents, but people will say, aha, yes, well, but the Jewish financial contributions. Again, more Jewish money went to Bush's opponents and Trump's opponents than went to either of these people. Right? And yet, in America and all over the world, people said that, the neoconservatives, the Jews were running the Bush administration. This was why we had the war with Iraq for Israel. All of this is Jewish power, right? And no one, yet it's not hard to discover that American Jews, the large majority of American Jews, cordially hated George Bush and really tried to get him out of office. And the hatred for Donald Trump is even more prominent. And if he runs again, we will see for the third time the American Jewish community in overwhelming numbers and overwhelmingly on a financial position working against him. And yet many people say, well, Trump's policy was the Jewish agenda. Bush's policy was a Jewish agenda. Obama, on the other hand, who was considered the least pro-Israel president and who fought publicly with Netanyahu throughout his administration and who negotiated the JCPOA that for many pro-Israel groups was a profound betrayal of Israel, President Obama was enormously popular throughout both terms with the American Jewish community. In 2008, only African Americans voted for Obama in a higher percentage than American Jews. Polls actually showed that American Jews were more favorable to the JCPOA than the public opinion at large. On Middle Eastern topics, as well as on most policy issues, by and large, the American Jewish community stands a bit to the left of the American average. That's just the way things are. None of this filters into the minds of people who assume that a hardline, pro-Likud, pro-Israel American policy is something that is being imposed on American society and American politics by the disciplined and united efforts of a relentlessly pro-Israel Jewish community. Right before the 1967 war, when Israel was in real peril, Lyndon Johnson was meeting with a group of Jewish leaders and said to them, you know, if you supported me on Vietnam, I would be more sympathetic to Israel. These leaders not only turned him down flat, but went out and attacked him in public, you know, for something just so underhanded as that and so insulting. The American Jewish community is not a monolithic voting bloc. It is not. It is by and large, today, as it's been for much of American history, it is less pro-Israel or less hardline pro-Israel in certain ways than American public opinion at large. So I did my best in the book to unearth the evidence behind this, and I have done my best to, as far as possible, try to present alternative views of why the U.S. has supported Israel. I can't say that I have been 100% successful in this. I'm afraid that I'm not the first person, the first Don Quixote to get on a horse or donkey and go tilting at the windmill of anti-Semitism and not actually knock it down. But it's worth a try, and perhaps some people will listen. The other myth that I wanted to talk about is this: there's an equal myth that somehow America and Israel have always been allies, and that Israel has depended on that American alliance. And without the American alliance, Israel could never have become such a strong state. And that if one could somehow, and this is, I think you can see this in a certain amount of anti-Israel political activism, if you could somehow find a way to drive a wedge between the United States and Israel, the Jewish entity would sort of, the Zionist entity would face an existential crisis, so that kind of resisting U.S. pro-Israel U.S. policy is in some way going to kind of bring about a Palestinian state or completely change the face of the Middle East. And again, this to me just doesn't fit the history. When Israel was small and weak and surrounded by enemies and poor, the United States wanted nothing to do with it. It's only in 1973 when Israel has, by winning the Six-Day War, emerged as a regional superpower and developed nuclear weapons, which the Nixon and Kissinger felt had happened by the time they took office. Developed those nuclear weapons against strong American efforts to try to stop the Israeli program. That was one of John F. Kennedy's highest political objectives, was to stop Israel's nuclear program. He failed, obviously. It's only when Israel is a regional superpower and a nuclear state that the U.S. and Israel begin to become strategically aligned and the modern alliance is formed. Israel did not become strong because it had an American alliance. It gained an American alliance because it had become strong. I found a very, very useful way to look at this is to look at the struggle over Israeli independence, where there's kind of a, and this again, this is a story that sometimes pro-Israel, often the American Jewish community will kind of tell this story, and then anti-Israel people will tell the same story. In the pro-Israel camp, it's how noble, courageous, hardworking American Jews persuaded the Truman administration to do the right thing, and so American Jews helped Israel emerge. That's one story. And then on the other, it's how, conniving, all-powerful Jewish lobbyists forced Harry Truman to override the wiser heads at the State Department and make the critical mistake of supporting Israel. All right, both of those are sort of two ways of talking about the same series of events. And I've often heard, as I've talked about this story in places, many people in my audience, especially older American Jews, will tell me, when I was a kid, the story of how Eddie Jacobson, a little old American Jew, small town, young buddy of Truman's, Israel's fate hung in the balance. Truman was refusing to see Chaim Weizmann, refusing to see all the Zionist leaders. But little Eddie Jacobson, like Queen Esther in the Bible, rushes into the moody Gentile ruler and says, "Save my people." And Truman says, "Okay, fine." He sees Weizmann, and Israel is saved, and history is changed. This is the proof that any little American Jew from a little town anywhere can change history and save Israel. It's a beautiful story, but it just doesn't have a lot of relationship to what happened. Jacobson did see Truman. Truman did agree to meet with Weizmann, but American policy didn't change at all after that meeting. The Truman administration continued to do everything it could to persuade the Palestinian Jews not to declare independence when the British mandate expired, and was doing everything it could to find some way to extend the UN trusteeship and so prevent a war. Now, the reason they did is because they thought the Jews would lose the war. George Marshall, Field Marshal Montgomery, the greatest military minds of the day, were convinced that the Jews would lose the war, and America, which is facing Stalin in the middle of Europe, is just not going to be able to do anything about it. And so you'd have another humanitarian catastrophe on the beaches of Palestine. That was the main reason that people like George Marshall were so angry about the whole thing. But what they didn't know, and the Israelis did, was that Stalin had agreed to sell arms to the Yishuv. That the State Department put an arms embargo on the Middle East when the UN partition plan was passed in November '47 and fighting broke out. We imposed an arms embargo, which had the effect of crippling the Jews and helping the Arabs, because the Arabs were being armed by the British, and the Jews had no source of weapons. So this was a de facto intervention on the Arab side, as many Zionists pointed out, that in fact what this did was like the embargo against Republican Spain during the Spanish Civil War that actually helped the fascists and hurt the Republicans in Spain. A lot of people made that comparison. By the way, more American Jews fought for the Spanish Republicans in the Spanish Civil War than fought for the Palestinian Jews in the Israeli War of Independence. And again, that's very much in line with the politics of the time. But Stalin's henchmen basically told the Jews of the Yishuv that they could buy arms from the Skoda arms works in Czechoslovakia. that had been making weapons for the Nazis in World War II under German rule. And obviously, when the Wehrmacht collapsed in May, there were a lot of weapons and no one was taking delivery. And the Czech communists needed money in order to finance the coup and their takeover of Czechoslovakia and destroying the sort of last remnants of freedom in the Soviet zone. And Stalin basically said, you can sell weapons to the Jews for hard currency, and this will support us in Czechoslovakia. And so they begin to send weapons, and these weapons play the key role in Israel's ability to win that war. They also begin to do training for advanced units. By the end, they're flying planes. And this is the critical thing. The Americans didn't know this at the time, as far as we can tell from CIA documents and so on, but that's what happened. Stalin has a greater claim than Truman to be considered the sort of the new Cyrus in that sense. None of this, most people in Israeli governments kind of know this. Israeli historians would know this. It's not something that people in the United States, generally speaking, know. It, by the way, helps account. The Americans did find out they were getting those weapons, which accounts for a great deal of the early American hostility to Israel, because it was seen as a stab in the back. The main thing the Americans were trying to do at that time was stop Stalin's march through Europe. And for Israel to sort of secretly make an end run and provide badly needed money to Stalin at this critical moment was a bit like, selling super high tech to China or something like that today. All right, there you are. Israel has always been its own state. It's never been a puppet of the United States. The United States has never had as much influence over Israel as many people in the United States would like to think. The last thing the Israeli cabinet did before voting for independence, to declare independence, was to vote to reject Truman's request that they delay the vote of independence. So Eddie Jacobson did not actually change history or American policy. Well, those are some myths. There are more. There are lots more. This is a subject that millions of people feel passionately about, but the feelings are, and this is often the case when emotions run high, the feelings are often not linked to close analysis of facts. Sometimes the facts sort of kind of tilt in Israel's direction and make Israel look better. Sometimes the facts kind of make Israel look not so good. So this myth busting is neither an apologia for the Israelis nor a kind of rallying cry for Palestinians. It's just an appeal to Americans. Let's try to get our heads on straight as we look at a very emotional subject, which has a lot of resonance in our politics. And I think that's really enough for me. I'd be happy to take questions at this point.
Walter, thank you so much for those insights. We'll turn to Q&A in one moment. Just want to give a quick blurb for tomorrow. At 8 p.m. at Harvard Hill, I will be hosting Noah Feldman from Harvard Law School discussing the current Israel judiciary crisis. We're going to begin with questions for people in the audience. So any show of hands, I'd love to entertain some. Just ask you to talk into the mic so our online audience can also follow.
So I'm curious, I think originally people thought of the Democratic Party as being the more pro-Israel party. And then now I think it's like there definitely are pro-Israel people on both sides, but I would say like the sentiment has shifted a little bit, like you were saying. I'm curious why you think that happened.
Good question. Israel was definitely a left-wing cause in the 40s and 50s. Peter, Paul, and Mary, a very left-wing folk group, used to sing kibbutz songs at their hootenannies. The Democratic Socialists of America considered Israel the great poster child for why socialism works, because Israel's economic policies were to the left of any of the European countries, and yet Israel was a democracy. So they'd say, you say socialism is incompatible with democracy, look at Israel. And Israel's socialist government had a strong defense. So you say socialism is incompatible with a strong military, look at Israel. It really was the poster child. And Israeli experiments in child rearing, the kibbutzim, the labor movement were seen all over the West as examples for the rest of us to follow. There's a long history and a tradition behind this too, basically where the more clerical and nationalist right had been more overtly anti-Semitic. So like in France, the anti-Dreyfusards were on the right, and then they tended to be, if you were an anti-Dreyfusard, the chances are you would later be pro-Vichy, and if you were pro-Dreyfus, you would be anti-Vichy. So there are a lot of things going into that left-wing identification. And again, in the 50s, Israel was generally speaking more popular in Europe than in the United States. Why did it change? I think it changed for a couple of things. One is that that as Israel sort of went Thatcherite, where Likud and the right start doing economic reforms in Israel in the 70s, it stops being a democratic socialist of America success story and starts looking like some kind of Reaganite, Thatcherite horror story from their point of view. And that's part of it. I think also when Israel goes from being a country of hungry, desperate refugees who are victims to maybe having victims or being seen to have victims of its own, that changes things a bit. And finally, the American right, Billy Graham has a lot to do with this. This is not the simple kind of fundamentalist, left behind, rapture, tribulation story people have. But if you think about it, in 1944, the Soviet troops pour into Poland, liberate the camps. And you start now you don't just hear about the Holocaust or read newspaper accounts. You see photographs, you see newsreels, just unspeakable horror. Okay, yeah, this is very terrible about the Jews, but it's also says something really horrible about humanity and about the Enlightenment. It's like the Enlightenment, with all this science and technology, we're supposed to be better people than those primitive, brutal, harsh people of the past. We're new and modern, and we're going to be nice to each other, and it's going to be a peaceful world. That's going to be so great. But look, Germany, the most cultured country in Europe, falls for the kind of horrible barbarism that it's the worst you've seen. The next year, 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this unreformable species of brutal cave-dwelling troglodyte people, now has the power to destroy itself. 1948, Israel, against the odds, wins. There's a long tradition in American Christianity that goes back to the 17th century of very important theologians saying that the Bible tells us that as history moves toward the climax, God will bring the Jewish people back to Palestine. And people have been writing about this. Jonathan Edwards, a famous theologian, had written about this. Increase Mather across the river in Boston was preaching about this in the 17th century. Long tradition of this, and then it happens, right? So you have these terrible, horrifying news, but now the existence of Israel, maybe the big guy is still in charge, maybe still upstairs. And Billy Graham's revivals and actually a vast global expansion of Christianity since 1950, the greatest expansion in the history of Christianity is, I think, connected in some ways to the sense that people see, oddly perhaps, but people see the return of the Jews to the Holy Land as the demonstration that Christianity is true. And it's that feeling of warmth as much as anything else, I think, that has the power to surge among conservatives and religious people in the US towards support for Israel.
Other questions?
I don't think it works. So, you said that there's nothing unique in the situation between Palestinians and Israelis, and the fact that there are always like some kind of like problems between native population and population that was immigrating to a specific land during the colonialist governance. And then I was thinking there's a huge difference because like in this situation, there's a debate between like both sides about who is the native. I mean, both sides claim to be the natives of the land. And is it not like
Right.
a huge
That's,
difference?
certainly that's an Israeli Zionist point of view. The Palestinians are not interested in that and don't see any validity. The Palestinian feeling about Jews in Israel is much more like the Burmese feeling about the Rohingya or the Malaysian feeling about the Chinese who came in under British rule than a simple, normal national dispute. I agree. The Israelis feel they also have a right, but the Rohingya are going to say, well, maybe our ancestors didn't live here for 1,000,000 years, but they've lived here for 100 years. That counts for something. So in all of these cases, both populations do feel that they live where they live of right and that they did no wrong in being there. And that's, so that you do, yes, it's not identical in every respect, but there really is a lot of continuity.
I want to ask you, not as about the American-Israel relationship, but currently what's happening in the Middle East and the sort of triangular relationship or relations between Israel, the Saudis, and Iran, and what you think's happening there and where it's going to go, and how is the American response to that developing?
Okay, well, actually, my column in the Wall Street Journal tonight sort of touches on this. And I think if we take a step back, a lot of people in the Middle East have begun losing confidence in American guarantees and American presence. And you can see why. I mean, first we elect Bush and we have one policy, then we elect Obama, we have almost an opposite policy. Then we elect Trump and we do something completely different. Then we elect Biden, we're sort of back to Obama. If you live in the Middle East, you have to think, what will these crazy idiots do next? You can't predict it, okay? And yet you have to, when you think about your security, you think about the security, the life of your kids, all right? So, you've gotten into the habit of assuming that the American presence is going to be predictable in the way that it works, and America is always going to be there, and America is always going to care. What if not? What if that's becoming less true? In the Trump years, what you saw with the Abraham Accords, it seems to me, was a lot of the Arab countries and Israel are sort of thinking, if the Americans are not as reliable, we are actually going to need to cooperate together against Iran. And the Arabs are also thinking, and we need to economically develop faster and technologically develop faster. And Israel is a good bet there. And also, if we combine our lobbying, if the Arab lobby and the Israeli lobby are working together in France and Britain, in the United States and Italy and so on, maybe we can get a little bit more done in terms of what we want on Iran. And I think that's that much more than the diplomatic genius of Jared Kushner is what led to the Abraham Accords, made the Abraham Accords possible. I mean, the Trump people did sort of facilitate, but that's what people were doing. Now, I think under Biden, they feel that America, and they're now moving to another stage of like America's really just exiting. And that America, I think many in the Middle East think America is ready to accept. We will say for 100 years that we don't accept an Iranian nuclear weapon, but fundamentally people think the Biden administration would rather have an Iranian nuclear weapon than have America involved in a war in the Middle East. And the sense is that that would probably, that would almost certainly break the Democratic Party if President Biden was leading a major American war into the Middle East. Add with what's going on in Ukraine, worries about Taiwan. It's not an irrational calculation that many people in the Middle East just think the United States has washed its hands of that. So what do you do then? If you're Saudi Arabia, you start thinking, well, where else can I look if I can't look to America? Israel without America is too small. What about China? Also, I'm going to need to come to some kind of I'm going to need to do two things. I'm going to have to try to be nice and cool it with Iran as best I can while I work as fast as I can to get a bomb of my own. And I think we can see the Saudis doing that. So it all makes sense to me what people are doing given their assumptions. And I think we're sort of getting a look at what kind of world, a preview of what kind of world it might be if the Americans really do decide that this whole world order thing is just too much trouble and we need to sit home and mind our own business for a while.
So do you think the world trying to cut its dependence on oil will affect the American, really the West interaction with the Middle East, and potentially, the West might see that it doesn't need the Middle East as much as it has in the past?
Right. The Middle East does not think the Greens know what they're talking about. And people that I talk to in the Middle East basically notice that we're always saying, okay, by 2060, we'll be off oil. But it looks like we're planning to go on a crash diet in 2057. And that what happens is every 5 years, when we've made very little progress, we sort of extend the deadline, but talk even more about all the crash diets we're going to go on as we get closer. And so there's a certain amount of cynicism. What they also note is that oil is not just used for energy, whether it's plastics, pharmaceuticals, the range of products that oil is an essential feedstock for is so very large that they don't really believe this. At the same time, they look at India and China and they just laugh. Okay, the Americans and the Europeans are going to recycle everything and go not only to carbon net zero, carbon net negative, and it won't make a dent in what's coming in India, China, Africa, and other places. That's basically what a lot of folks in the Middle East think. But they do think that American crazy attitudes and green politics sort of, these sort of like Americans screaming about how green we want to be, might well lead to the United States withdrawing from the Middle East, an additional factor. And again, the relationship with the Saudis is a combination of they were going to be the long-term energy player. They have 150 years of oil in the desert. And so they don't need to try to squeeze out every dime by jacking up the price as high as possible. In fact, their smarter play is to have such a reasonable oil price that you don't have a lot of work for substitutions for oil. And so that Saudi commitment to the long-term health of the oil market meant that on price policy in OPEC, they generally were leaning in the direction we'd like them to go. And then on the other hand, we provided that absolute security thing. So now we're trying to abolish the long-term energy market, and we're totally squeamish about their security guarantees. So we've pretty much torched the basis of the US-Saudi relationship. I'm not sure what we're getting for it. You know, I don't know what the gain is, but, you know, obviously there are people who think we're gaining plenty. So, you know, that's where we are, I think.
What do you think is the best reason for why the US should be less pro-Israel? And then what is your response to that?
Well, I don't actually think that being I don't think American foreign policy should be a question of being pro-Israel or anti-Israel. I think American foreign policy should be, we should look at our national interests and kind of try to think intelligently, and if we can, in a long-term, thoughtful way about them, and then make decisions based on that. And sometimes those decisions might work, and people might say, oh, look at the pro-Israel policy. And sometimes those decisions might lead to some people say, well, why are you so nasty to Israel? But in both cases, it would be fundamentally about American strategic interests. By and large, that is, I think, what's happened, by and large, historically. But what I think as far as I can see, there is a strategic alignment of American and Israeli interests is on the assumption that we care about the Middle East. On that assumption, okay, US and Israeli interests have a lot in common, because the thing that we don't want to see or haven't wanted to see, and in my view, probably still, we don't want any country other than ourselves, because we can be trusted, but others cannot. We don't want any country other than ourselves to have the ability to block the flow of oil from the Middle East to world markets, right? You know, because anybody who had that ability could basically hold a gun to the global economy. And even if we're self-sufficient in oil, you know, thanks to fracking or whatever, and we're not importing from the Middle East, Japan is, and Europe is, and so on. Imagine what would happen to our Ukraine policy if the price of oil in Europe went up to $200 a barrel. What would happen to American corporate earnings, the loans that American banks have made globally, et cetera? It'd be horrible. And so any country that had the ability to interfere with that would pose, would really be a problem for us. Israel feels that any country which was was that strong in the Middle East was a threat to Israel's independence, because an Iran that's that dominant or a Turkey that's that dominant really is a problem for Israel. And so Israel and the United States do, in my view, have a common strategic interest in preventing the domination of the Middle East by any single country. And the Gulf Arab states, by and large, share that interest. So that's the basis, I think, for, that has been the basis for American policy in the region for a long time. Again, we are now seeing that question and people saying, no, the U.S. really doesn't have that many important in the United States, our most important interest in the Middle East is getting out of the Middle East. If that's true, and that's the view that we hold, people will not see, there will not necessarily be strategic alignment of interest between the U.S. and Israel, though there would well be, specific issues that we might see eye to eye on. Okay.
Hi. Can you talk more about the definition of Zionism and its relationship or absence of relationship with colonization?
Sorry, of what? Of Zionism and colonization? Well, I think, Zionism is Zionism is one of the national movements that's rooted in Eastern and Central Europe and the Middle East from, beginning in the latter half of the 19th century. If you think about what Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East looked like in 1870 or so, they're basically four big empires plus Greece. There's the Ottoman Empire, which includes much of, Southeastern Europe. There's the Russian Empire, which sticks way into Europe, the Baltic states, Finland, Poland. There's the German Empire, which includes a lot of Poland and other places, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire that includes chunks of the Balkans, Czechoslovakia, et cetera. All right. And where and ethnic groups and religious groups are mingled all over in those places, almost like India today, where you have lots of castes and so on, all mingled together. And so you would have, like in Bosnia, you might have Turkish-speaking Muslim landlords ruling over Serbo-Croatian speaking Orthodox peasants, right? And in parts of what's now Romania, you would have a mix of Hungarian and German-speaking landlords ruling primarily over Transylvanian peasants. And in the cities, you would have groups of traders and merchants who were often like ethnically, so again, you'd had Germans scattered in cities all the way through that part of the world. Jews obviously scattered in some ways, not just in cities. And over the next, between like 1870 and basically 1950, what you see there is that these ethnically, religiously mixed, culturally mixed empires turn into, by and large, mono-ethnic, mono-national states. And this process almost everywhere involves genocides, mass expulsions, ethnic cleansing. It's almost never pretty. And it's a direct contributor to both World War I and World War II, as well as a lot of other wars. And this process, it seems to me, is intimately associated with democracy, partly democracy, because ethnic groups mobilize in democratic politics, but generally speaking, economic development. And changes the relationship of groups to the state, creates much more demand to be ruled by people like you. In some ways, this process is now continues to spread. So that what's happening in Ethiopia looks quite a bit like some of the wars that used to happen in the Balkans and so on. So to me, what's going on here is basically Zionism was the effort of Europe, primarily European Jews. There were some non-European Jews involved in it, who say, okay, everybody's getting a home here and you're not safe. You're going to die if you don't have a place. We have to have a place. And for them, the lands of the Bible were kind of the only place where you could get even speculatively a critical mass of Jews willing to go to. So this, colonialism is what happens when a ruling state, a national state goes outside of its own territory, historic territory, and conquers a chunk of land and runs its own flag up on it. So the French in Algeria, or the British, in 90% or whatever it was, all over the world, setting up an empire. So it's a very different thing. If you look, there's a sense in Israel today. I mean, there's a sense people look at Israel and say, aha, it's European colonialism of, it's white colonialism in a brown country, is to sort of like, put the sloganizing. But, actually today there are more Jews in Israel are actually of a Middle Eastern origin than are of a West European origin. More Jews are descended from Jews who were kicked out of other Middle Eastern countries by Arabs, basically, than they are people who fled Europe. So while one can look at this situation and you can see why people might talk in terms of colonization and all of this, you start getting into the political dynamics, and it's different. It's much more like what some of these other struggles have been. Now that, none of this is to say that I don't sympathize with Palestinians who didn't ask for any of this, didn't ask for their land to be in someone else's holy books. And sort of, at the very moment when they're sort of beginning to think about life after the Ottoman Empire, are now going to have to deal with this. So, my own sense is that both the Jews of this imperial zone and the Palestinian Arabs of Palestine were both dealt really harsh hands by history.
Do you have any other questions from the audience in person? So I'll ask you two questions coming from online. Just ask them at the same time. They're very different, though. One has to do with the Ashkenazi and Mizrahi demographics within Israel. For a long time, the Ashkenazim were the most powerful politically and often mistreated some of the Mizrahi population. And a question coming from online has to do with that balance of power now shifting, and how do you see that playing out? And the second is, why do you personally care so much about this?
Okay. First question. I would say that we are seeing a change in Israel, that the Israeli state was founded essentially by Ashkenazi secular Jews from, by and large, Poland West. Tragically, these were the people for whom Herzl intended his message. Tragically, his message was, if you don't get out of Europe, you're going to die. And tragically, 6 million of them did. They didn't get out and they did die. But the ones who got out, many of them went to Israel. And they were the establishment. And they built the institutions in many ways that have made Israel what it is today. The IDF, the political system, maybe that's less exciting. The economy, the tech sector, they've been disproportionately represented in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they've had a very creative history there, the scientific accomplishments, et cetera. But they didn't treat the Mizrahi very well. And they were put in, sort of European Jews arriving, Holocaust refugees got kind of the better refugee assignments and the better jobs and better access to education. And by and large, the Middle Eastern Jews sort of didn't do as well. Now, Israel, in some ways, in terms of Israel's PR in the West, it always put forth its most European face. So basically, we're like Denmark, only we happen to be in Palestine, was kind of the Israeli thing. Now they're haunted by this because people say, well, why aren't you more like Denmark? Instead of saying, gosh, you're really a lot better than Yemen. That in a sense that Israel proposed itself as a European country. But in fact, Israel's demography was never as European as its image. And over time, as the Mizrahi have had more children, and then as the Haredi, many of whom are in fact from Europe, but are not of the secular mindset that ruled Israel for a long time, they also have a very different point of view. So Israel today is less and less like the Israel that most of us thought we knew in the past. That's a huge problem for Israel. We're seeing it being fought out in a way on the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, even as I speak to you tonight. And as Israel struggles to find some kind of political solution that the very different elements of the Jewish nation can feel that they belong to, of the Israeli nation. And of course, let's not forget, you've also got Palestinian Arabs, some of whom are very religious, some of whom are very secular. So it's a pretty complicated place. I don't know how it's going to end up. I hope it will end in a creative compromise. That I look at Ben-Gurion, whose greatest accomplishment was to build a Jewish state. And he always knew that state building was the most important task he faced. And he concentrated, the key to his entire career was doing everything he could to create the best conditions for the Jewish state. Jabotinsky disagreed with him at certain key points, but both of these great figures in 20th century Israeli history saw the creation of a strong state as the goal of politics. And I think they were right, by the way. I think the Israeli success in building a state contrasting to a Palestinian failure at state building. And I'm not blaming people or saying, but it's just that Palestinian politics did not succeed in state building and still, in a sense, has not built a state. This was the key to their success, and preserving that is the key to Israel's success in the future. I don't know if they'll succeed. Now, why do I care? Interesting question. I think I care for several reasons. One is I really don't like prejudice and hate. I grew up in the South, in North and South Carolina before the Civil Rights Act, and I remember segregation, and I remember the power of prejudice. And I saw how that blighted both the lives of the people who were victimized by prejudice and the lives of people who were warped by prejudice. And I hate hate. Because of the way that my education has taken me, and my career, where I've encountered, again, as I said at the start of the talk, globally, so the power of these stereotypes about Jews and Jewish power to warp people's minds and warp their understanding, not just of Jews, but of the United States and why we do what we do and what American foreign policy is about, for better or for worse. Something in me just wants to clean that up. But I think, too, as a Christian, my father was an Episcopal priest, and when I was in Pakistan talking to a group of students, said, you have to know I went to a madrasa as a religious high school. Groton School is an Episcopal school. We had chapel 8 times a day. So I've had a strong religious education, religious background, and it means a lot to me. And I look at the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, and I'm appalled and ashamed at the Christian record. And I don't want to be part of that ongoing scandal. And I am thrilled. I read the story of how William Heckler was a huge help to Herzl. And I've had some conversations actually with Bibi Netanyahu. One is on an interview on the record that as you can see at the Wall Street Journal website, where he talks about how the support of Christians for Zionism has changed the relationship between Christianity and Judaism in a way that he finds significant. So, that's a mix of sort of emotional, rational, political calculations. I think, like everything else, that's important, you do it for a whole bunch of reasons, and you don't yourself always understand all the reasons behind what you do. But somewhere in there is the answer. And while I don't plan to write any more books on US-Israel relations, I do plan to continue to work against anti-Semitism, to work against hate. And, and that's, by the way, also hate of Palestinians and hatred against them. I don't like any of it. Sometimes I think, by the way, that when I write my memoirs, the title will be The Night Yasser Arafat Kissed Me, because the first time I went to Israel was actually to meet Yasser Arafat in Gaza for an interview. And at the end of it, he did very nicely give me a sweet kiss on the top of my head. And I have traveled in a lot of refugee camps, spoken to Palestinians all over. I find wonderful things. I've had incredible moments. So I don't like hate. I'd like to see peace. I don't think I'm going to be the one. I'm not appointed to bring peace to the Middle East, but I hope to stay involved one way or another with these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. That was really masterful. For those of you who want to hear more or read more from Walter, this great book here, The Ark of a Covenant, you can find it online. I said in my opening remarks that Walter was someone who can really be a model for nuance, and I think you demonstrated that so clearly today. So thank you all who were here in person. We had over 300 people online. And thank you, Walter.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. Great.
And I think this guy wants you to sign.
Yes. This is